My name is Elizabeth Oldfield. I am hosting today's festival. When I'm not doing this, I work broadly in the fields of spirituality, finding ways, working with organisations and individuals to deepen their spiritual life, and reconciliation and peace building, working with a range of organisations, particularly with activists, looking to do the inner work to help them do their outer work better, to avoid accidentally polarising, to avoid accidentally deepening the exact problems that they are trying to tackle. And I also have a podcast called The Sacred, where I talk to wonderful people about their values and hope to build empathy across our increasingly deep differences. And today I am just delighted to speak to Alastair. I'm not going to read a long biography of him because you all have access to Google and you have a little printout in your programme as well. But I will just draw attention to this, which is his most recent book, which I have been reading ahead of this gathering, and which I would wholeheartedly recommend, and some of the themes of which we'll be talking about today. I want to kick off with just a small question, Alastair. You've said you don't like small talk either, so that's great, which is really about the frame of the festival, is about finding a space where we can unlearn some things and we can reimagine some things. So to begin with that unlearning, what are the kind of things that you think we as a society need to unlearn?
Can I just point out, first of all, folks, that I am extremely deaf. And so Elizabeth is wearing a little Bluetooth transmitter just to help me catch things. And that's also why I've got my phone with me. I'm not doing my emails as I'm talking to you. And when we move to audience interaction, I will ask for this to be passed around with another one on it. The advantage, of course, of being deaf is that you turn down the volume of the outside world and correspondingly have an invitation to turn up the volume of the inner world. And so my short answer to your opening short question, Elizabeth, is that I think that many of us need to unlearn our attachment to a materialistic view of reality. Whether we hold that in theory or not, most of us hold it in practice. And to reimagine, or that's almost the wrong way of putting it, because it implies that we do the reimagining. I would say to settle into the deep imagination of progressive layers of being, which are the ground of imaginal reality as the creative source of all being in itself.
And what helps us unlearn that very dominant frame of a kind of material world, almost a mechanistic world, driven by growth, you know, the things that many of us are here because we feel exiled in or uncomfortable with or skeptical of? What are the practices or the places or the people that you found have helped you personally come to deprogram yourself from that? And even that's a mechanistic turn of phrase that I've accidentally used.
My short answer would be suffering and desire. That often it's not until our consensus trans reality, as Charles T. Tart, the consciousness researcher, calls it, gets a wallop, perhaps literally a car accident, an illness, disappointment in love. It's often not until that happens, or when we come into close contact with suffering in others, through solidarity with the poor, the broken, and the marginalised. It's often not until then that we get a wake-up call. There must be more to life than this. And that question is the beginning of the spiritual search. And then desire. Blowing and having others blow on that flame of the spiritual spark, the light of John's Gospel 1:9, the light that enlightens all people who comes into the world, blowing on one another's flame bring that hunger for the divine through whatever framework may or may not want to frame it, that hunger for the deeper ground of being into reality.
When I asked Alastair what would he like to talk about today, he went, God. And I was going to ease you into it. But now we're not. I will do one, preparatory question. You wanted to talk about God. I love talking about God.
And they all think we're bonkers.
Well, there will be a big mixture in the room, right? There will be people who are like, yes, and people are like, oh no, here we go. Why is it, for those of us, and even I sometimes find it difficult, why is it so hard to talk about spirit, the divine, the love beyond us, or the G-bomb, that big hefty God word? What is it that makes that so difficult?
Well, I think, my parents' generation, I'm 66, my parents' generation, the generation mostly already dead now, they couldn't talk openly about sex, but they could talk about God, at least in narrow religious tramlines. And now we can talk about sex, at least in narrow tramlines. But if we talk about God, the goddess, Allah, Brahman, Tao, the ground of being, then people's their bullshit detectors start twitching, their cult detectors turn on. And I think this is a very deep problem, because we're faced, Elizabeth, especially if that smack happens to us, or if that inner loneliness comes on us, that inner yearning for something I can't get no satisfaction because I try and I try and try. If that comes on us, we are then faced with the question, what is the nature of reality? Now, most of us would accept the reality of physical reality. And to those postmodern deconstructionists, I don't want to disrespect the service that's been done by deconstruction to deconstructing structures of social power. But when it gets extended to the point where, as I've sometimes been challenged in academic conferences, somebody who probably lives most of their lives in a library will say, and I quote, "But nature is just a social construction in the minds of people who live in cities." I say to them, may I take you home to the Hebrides and take you out in a boat in a Hebridean stone, where if you do the wrong thing, you're down the great cosmic plug hole. May I take you there? And then we will see how long nature as a social construction will be of service for.
I wanted to ask you to be a bit more personal than perhaps I've heard you be, about God, the divine, your preferred language in your life. Was that always present and real to you? Was that their moment of crisis or crash that brought it into focus for you?
Well, I was born in Doncaster of an English mother who's the nursing sister in charge of the children's ward in the Doncaster Royal Infirmary, and a Scottish father who had just graduated in medicine after the Second World War and got his first job as a junior doctor down there. And my father was desperate to get back to Scotland and became the doctor in 1960, when I was 4, became the doctor in the parish of North Lochs in the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. So that's where I grew up and went to school and it's my place of umbilical connection. Although very interestingly, a few years ago, 6 years ago, when I was going down the A1, I diverted into Doncaster and went to Armthorpe, the mining town where my father had been doctor. And you know, folks, if I'm not so deaf, I would have loved to have gone into the pub and just talked to people. But it would have been too strange holding little microphones and so on. But I just felt, you know, if I was living there, I would hope that I would be able to make the same people-place kind of connections. I think that once you learn how to do this, to hold, I was talking to Nick this morning, to hold a space that is hospitable to the soul, as the American Quaker Parker Palmer calls it. Once you learn how to do this, and it's not rocket science, it usually just involves a little bit of physical space, even on Zoom, and either food or, as Jonathan well knows, my famous whiskey club late at night on a Zoom. Once you learn how to do that, you've got a transferable skill. You've got a skill that can take you into, in my experience, any part of the world, and the party happens. So that's where I was raised. And of course, it is famously, you know, it's famous for the so-called wee freeze. And the wee freeze, the conservative evangelical sects, out of which, incidentally, Donald Trump's mother was born. Donald Trump's mother was born 8 miles from my village in 1912. And on the eve of her 17th birthday in 1930, is this adding up right? Something like that. Forgive my maths. She emigrated to America. She was of a generation that had been walloped by multiple levels of trauma. And for some they left, and for some they found somebody like Frederick Christ Trump to marry. And so it was that a woman born in a traditional black house has a son who ended up living in the White House. And the way yesterday's hearings were going, it is likely to be in a different kind of house if it carries on. So to leave it was one option. The other option was to deepen into it. So I grew up in what I would now call a profoundly religious community. Not in the sense of a sect or a religious order, but in one which, to quote the grandfather of my friend, the eminent Scottish folk singer Mary Campbell, to quote Duncan Campbell, revival is a community saturated in God. I grew up in a community that was saturated in God. And of course, what did we all want as kids? We wanted to, and I quote, and remember, this was before most island people had even left the island. Most people grew up and lived in the place where they were born and never went very far, unless they were men going into the military or the merchant marine. And so these were people who were profoundly immersed. Yeah. So most of us would grow up saying, what did we want to do as soon as we left school? We wanted to, quote, get out of the dump. We wanted to, I mean, here you are in the most beautiful part of the world, and what do you want to do? You want to get out. So it's kind of like we got out. We all went off university, wherever, travelled the world. I went off to Papua New Guinea for 4 years. And in the course of that, quite a lot of us, and certainly me, rejected that religion. I remember once, Elizabeth, in school we would be taken along to interminable Presbyterian sermons. And I remember once a preacher was preaching something, I forget what it was, but it was almost certainly Calvinist double predestination. That you lot, or rather, actually, it's really just us lot, it's actually quite small. We are predestined from before the foundations of the world were laid. I hope I'm not blowing your sister here. If so, may it be blown to kingdom come. Before the foundations of the earth were laid. We were predestined chosen, the chosen people, to go to heaven. And the rest of you, I'm very sorry, but you are there. And no matter what you think this is what Donald Trump's mother was immersed in. This is how Donald Trump knew how to appeal to that American right-wing evangelical constituency. He knew how to tap in that cosmic them and us division that Calvinism has in it. So, of course, I grew up, Elizabeth, listening to things like that, rejecting it. But, I decided I could not be an atheist because an atheist presumes to know. An atheist is a very clever person, people. An atheist presumes to know that God does not exist. And they would say, well, Alastair, you'll probably say, we should believe in fairies on the same basis, to which I would reply, as in the discussion I had with Tibor this morning, in our tradition, the realm of fairy, of the Shia, of the Shian, the fairy hill, is the realm of imaginative reality. That's where the imagination comes from. I won't go further into that just now. But I decided that, in fact, it was actually our minister who said to me, Church of Scotland minister in our case, he said, well, you then, Alastair, are an agnostic. I said, what's that? Noses, without knowing. You're taking the position you don't know. And as soon as I heard that, I thought to myself, well, I need to, I was into science. My first degrees in science, a BSc degree from Aberdeen University. I love science. I love scientific method. In my work on climate change, I always defer to the real climate scientists, the consensus expert science, and not to those on the fringe who make out that they know better than the consensus expert science. So I love scientific method. I love evidence-based reality. But, you see, Elizabeth, in the community in which I was growing up, there was also fairly regular experience of what we call the second sight, of paranormal experience. And when I went to Papua New Guinea, I found exactly the same thing. People on the island would know somebody had died on the mainland before the letter came. When I was 18, having to reset my chemistry and swatting over the summer, I was sitting at my desk one day. My father was ill. He was in Regmore Hospital. And my mother had just driven off 10 minutes earlier to fly over to Inverness and see him. So she was 10 minutes gone. And my mother would drive into town most days of the week. So she'd been doing this for years. And as I looked out the window, bored out my mind, because fortunately I failed chemistry, and a wise advisor studies said, well, why don't you do moral philosophy instead next year, Alastair? And then when I failed my second year geology, he said, why don't you do psychology instead? It was our failures. Yeah. Don't miss the opportunity, folks. When this hits you, and your parents are pouring doom and gloom on you as being a failure of the son they had hoped for, and so on. When this hits you, don't waste that opportunity. And as I watched, my father's beloved whippet, Sheba, who he had rescued, came out of the ditch on the other side of the road, straight across into a passing van and killed outright. And I ran over and I said to the shocked driver, the distressed driver, I said, look, I saw it happen. You couldn't have done anything. Don't even bother reporting it to the police as you're meant to do if you kill a dog. I said, you couldn't do anything. And I did what a country child would do. I went to the cow's byre, the cow's shed, and I got a spade and a hessian sack, and I put Sheba's inert body into it. went out to the moor, started digging the grave, and I had just got the grave down about 3-4 feet, when to my astonishment, and I was in a state of what I would now recognise as regression to a childlike state. I was wanting my, at the risk of quoting Prince Charles, wanting my mummy and daddy. Okay? Because remember, this was before you could phone the hospital. You had to have a trolley that came along and plugged you in some complex apparatus to phone. How was I going to tell Dad that Sheba was dead? And just as I dug the grave, my mother's car reappears at high speed over the top of the hill. She jumps out looking like a ghost and she shouts at me. What's the matter? The dog's dead. Thank goodness. I thought it might have been a child. She thought it might have been me or my sister Isabel. She had felt this overwhelming compulsion to turn back. Now, the incident I've just described to you happened to me personally. I'm not asking you to believe that. I might be lying to you. Except I'm not. And if any of you have any doubt, roll out the whiskey club later on tonight and put me to the lie test then. But the point is, Elizabeth, growing up in that kind of community where another world, what our tradition calls the other world, the Celtic other world, is a living presence, starts to build up points of data that collectively become evidence. And so the reason I was failing my exams at university is that I'd founded the Aberdeen University Parapsychological Society. We had all kinds of interesting people come and speak. And that was leading me into this question, is there or is there not a divine reality? And then, my goodness, transcendental meditation and all of that was all the rage. I got introduced to the Bhagavad Gita. I read the Upanishads. I had hold of F.C. Happel's little book, Mysticism, which is out of print, but you could find it secondhand. And I started reading this stuff. And all I can say, Elizabeth, is it spoke truth. Yeah. I just felt that this was, Christians speak of the way, I am the way, the life, and the truth. It spoke truth. The Greek truth is aletheia, as you know, meaning also reality revealed. It spoke reality revealed. And so I'm sorry, I've given you a long answer then.
You've given me riches. And why do you think it's important to speak about the divine, to speak about spirituality, in a world that, for some very good reasons, can find that very difficult? And maybe perhaps for those of us who are interested in contributing, living well, seeking to be part of the solution, not part of the problems that the world is facing.
Well, Richard Rohr, the wonderful Franciscan spiritual teacher, he plays in this kind of Jungian idea of two halves of life. And the first half of life, which is speaking psycho-spiritually, not necessarily chronologically. So some people never get there. Some people, you see them getting there as children. The first half of life is building the outward framework. It's ego development. So I don't have a downer on ego. When I'm sitting here as Alastair McIntosh, I'm in the programme, my books are up there and so on. I don't have a downer on that. That is how I'm called to serve this outer aspect of life. But, Rohr says, if you stay stuck in that, you become an overgrown child. And look at all the, especially privileged people you will know who have become overgrown children, and they're stuck in that materialistic world. So he says the task of the second half is that you live out of the container that you have formed. You then start letting go of it in a sense and living into a deeper level of life. And so I would say to you, in response to your why, Elizabeth, that if we don't start at least being receptive to the possibility of a divine reality, And forget about the stereotypes. Forget about God as an old man up there casting down spells of fire upon the world or whatever. Forget about all of that. Let go into the mystery. Read the mystical texts. Engage in practices like pilgrimage, contemplation. And then what you will find in terms of the why is that the loneliness that you might have sensed starting to deepen in you, the loneliness will start to be filled. You will find gradually that you have a deep hand holding you. Gradually. And often that will go. I mean, mystics talk of the dark night of the soul, where you've kind of recognized the bankruptcy of the outer world as your primary source of satisfaction, but you've not yet built the inner world. And that's a dark night of the soul. It can be a very depressing time, but friends, don't waste that depression. Don't waste that depression. Again, use all of these things as a spade with which to dig. And so the why, because it deepens us into being. It allows us to see that our human nature and nature natural is one great cosmic emergence, the Tao breaking into the 100,000 things, the unfolding of the Dharma, the way, the truth, the life.
Thank you. I'm going to just read a little half a paragraph on that. I'm not suggesting that we tackle climate change through non-action, but I am suggesting there are qualities of presence and inner grounding, whether we call them Tao, Dharma, Satya, the way, the truth and the life, that can awaken the gentleness and visionary motivation that we need, both action and contemplation. And I want to just dig into that a little bit because you've spoken about, and I think many of us are aware that there are forms of spirituality that can feel like spiritual bypassing, or we can allow to become narcissistic, or forces and frameworks and kind of instrumentalizing of spirituality can feel like it doesn't have the robustness and the rigor that we need to help us become the kind of people that the world needs. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Okay, so when Matt Carmichael, a Leeds climate-based activist, took my teaching notes from courses I used to teach at Edinburgh and Strathclyde and the Open University in spiritual activism, the spiritual basis of activism for social, environmental and spiritual change, we built into it a chapter on cults and charisma. When charisma goes wrong. So charism is a Greek word meaning a spiritual gift. But as my Native American friends have said to me, there is nothing more evil than a spiritual gift abused. And that's the dynamics of a cult. It sucks life out of people by seeming to offer that which gives life. But as the prophet Jeremiah puts it, these are cracked cisterns that can hold no water. And yet, often these things are stepping stones in people's spiritual journey. So the way that I would put it is that when I see somebody engaged in what I would think of as a cultic setup, I'll engage softly in conversation with them. I'll try not to push them into a corner from which they can only come out fighting. And I do exactly the same with my conservative evangelical friends. Try not to push them out into a corner, but listen to them and draw out, the fundamental question. When Jesus was walking along the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter and Andrew start following him, and then he turns round and he says, "What seek ye? What seek ye? What are you seeking? What are you yearning for? What is, as the Jesuits put it, what is your desire? Follow your desire." And ask yourself, is the spiritual community organization that I'm involved with, is it leading me into a deeper life? Leading me into Jungian individuation, becoming an undivided person, an integrated person? Or is it no longer serving me like that? So I think of it as, like stepping stones across a river. And all of these, Ram Dass, a great American Jewish Hindu teacher who died a couple of years ago, Ram Dass says, the method will always take you on the next step. But remember, friends, the method is also a trap. And you know what happens if you stay on the stepping stone in the middle of the river for too long, you'll get swept away in the flood. So keep moving, keep testing what you are in. Does it give life? Does it serve love? Does it build community that brings others into their freedom? Or does it subtly enslave us?
I want to pick up on that community word because I think it's one of the deepest hungers of our society and one of the hardest things to find, particularly those who are on this process of awakening to a sense of divine reality, whatever words you want to give that. You know, the structures of so-called organised religion are, as we know, creaky, and many people...
Did you say creepy?
Creaky.
Oh, sorry, I misheard her.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are some that are also creepy. But I'm just going to let that giggle run because it's so delightful. And many people, aren't sure if they would find a welcome, aren't sure if they'd find a home. But they are the traditional places of formation, of rigour, of mutual accountability, of having people around you to whom you've committed your life who will blow on each other's spark, as you so beautifully said. What do we do with that? How do we square the circle of some nerves about authoritarianism or unhealthy institutions, but not just be free-floating individuals very at prey to market forces telling us what spirituality looks like, rather than communities of wisdom and moral formation?
Well, if I might make use of these windows here, and I think of, what is a religion? I think of a religion as being like a trellis up which the vine of life, John 15 uses a metaphor. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. We're all profoundly interconnected. We're all Buddha nature. An organised faith group I think of as a trellis up which the vine of life should be able to grow, to reach the sun, to sweeten grapes, to make a wine that inebriates us. I use that word instead of intoxicates us. Inebriates us from the root meaning to drink. Allows us to drink of God consciousness. The problem is that any gardener's trellis requires maintenance. It's a human-made structure. Our religions are human-made structures. So, as the 16th century reformers rightly pointed out, the Reformed Church must be the church that is always reforming itself. But of course, often that doesn't happen. The process gets stuck. And these things become decrepit and damaging. So our question always is how to free the vine. Now, a lot of us just now, the vine of our lives has been growing wild along the ground because the structures are so corrupted. But, the problem with saying me and my spirituality is that if, as Bell Hooks put it, it's all about love. If, as Adrian Rich puts it, it's about the dream of a common language, then you cannot do this on the basis of me and mine. Jesus in Matthew's Gospel goes 8 times to the mountains or the wild places, but then back amongst the multitudes. You have to do both. And when you come back amongst the multitudes, when you come down from the mountain to be amongst the people, where the SH1T hits the fan, and life is messy, and there is suffering, and a call, the liberation theology call for solidarity with the poor. Not charity, but solidarity with the poor, with the marginalised, with the oppressed. When that happens, you need some kind of structures. I mean, we're going to form a religion, okay, this weekend. So, what's going to be the basis of it, folks? Well, it's not autumn, so we won't try doing the magic mushroom thing. But if it was autumn, are we going to, are psychedelics going to be part of it? Because that's often part of people's path. We realise that the erotic is part of spiritual life. Are we going to bring that in? So are we going to have naked dancing come midnight and so on? What's going to be allowed? Or are we just going to sit and... Are we just going to take... I mean, there's a whole shelf up there of Bibles, some of them that size. Are we just going to sit and read our Bibles and... well, maybe we can do all of these things. You have to agree. You have to agree. Our religion is a structure of agreement. And so, we move into that. And we serve that community. So important that we serve these communities. I noticed yesterday Nick thanking the staff. He said, they're not here just now, but you will hear me thanking the staff who have worked their butts off to make that happen. And I took the opportunity last night of passing that on to two of the staff, just to make sure they knew. That, by the way, is how you make community. You're probably going to ask me, how do you make community? You catch the moment. You catch something like that, and you use that as a spade to dig with. You make community in those little ways. And
are you part of a faith community, a local church or a local other gathering, or the GalGael trust that you're involved in? Do you see that as some kind of faith community?
Well, I became a Quaker in the 1980s. The word Quaker was coming up, and you'd go to peace protests. We've got the Faslane nuclear submarine base in Scotland, and there'd always be, these elderly people making the tea. And you'd kind of, they'd say, Glasgow Quakers or something like that. And then you read books about Jung, who I am very influenced by, and often the Quakers would be mentioned. And so, I started digging into it and thought, well, this is what I am. I don't sit very comfortably with modern Quakers. They are too non-theist, too rejecting of the Bible, of God, of Christ. They don't understand, I'm generalizing horribly, a lot of them don't understand what Christ is about. And yet I understand why that is organisational. And it's because so many contemporary Quakers are people who have felt they've had to leave their original faith groups. There were women who were in a church where women's spiritual ministry was not fully honoured. There were gay people who had the Bible thrown at them by people who failed to recognise that Jesus never lifted a finger or said a word about the gays. That kind of thing. And the trouble is that sometimes the wounded can be wounding. So they bring their rejection with them. And part of my work within Quakerism just now is saying to folk, look, folk, we need to recognise the wounds that spiritual abuse has laid upon us. When we would be threatened with a leather belt for not learning the Westminster Shorter Catechism in school, as happened in those days, that was spiritual abuse. But we need to be forgiving. I had the privilege recently of meeting one of our teachers who was very heavy with the belt. My goodness, what a beautiful meeting it was. Obviously a man now well into his 80s. And he says, he said, when I was at teacher training college, we were taught to go in hard. And he said, I never liked it, and I was glad when they abolished it. And yet he'd been caught up in it. Have I answered your question? Or?
Yeah, you have. Thank you. I could talk about that all day, but I also want to hear a bit more about your very anti-individualist vision. This book is full of stories of nations telling their stories, tribes telling their stories, families, communities, whether it's in Lewis, whether it's in West Papua. your work on land reform trust. We've got workshops coming up on soil, on place, you know, whether you call it localism or rootedness or bioregionalism or the Celtic tradition that you draw on. It's shot through your vision and your writing. You said a people without a history cannot know themselves. And I was thinking, you know, so beautiful and so inspiring. When I read those kind of things elsewhere, or sometimes I say those kind of things, I have a dear friend who is a liberal cosmopolitan and he is Jewish, which is not irrelevant. He will say he is very nervous of rootedness, of people's stories, of place, because he fears it shading into nativism, xenophobia, fear of the other. I would love you to speak more to that, because it feels like one of the great tensions, that there is a positive richness in a vision that you're trying to articulate that does have risks, and, you know, that is used badly by people in the world, but nevertheless is part of what we're looking for. How do you navigate those tensions?
Okay, so I look on community, I think of the metaphor of a basket or a cloth. And you have the warp of community, which are the various elements of what makes up a community. In today's world, often going out at warp speed and scattering. And then you have the weft, the sideways bits, which it's our task to weave into. We can all, no matter what our station in life, we can all weave in a bit of the weft of community. But a basket is a semi-permeable container. It gives structure, but it doesn't necessarily trap. It can hold, but doesn't necessarily hold in. So to my mind, a healthy community is one that is semi-permeable. Yes, there's certain boundaries to entry. Not just anybody can walk into your house and expect to be part of the family. In the same with a community, there has to be, like I was talking about with the trellis of a religious structure, there has to be certain understandings of what you can do. Now, you mentioned the GalGael. One of the things that we introduced about 10 years ago in GalGael, we're now in our 25th anniversary year, in Govan, the part of Glasgow where I live, which some of you might have known through the Rab C. Nesbitt show on BBC television, the former shipbuilding area. Ships are still built there, but only warships, hence why it's a former shipbuilding area. One of the things that we did about 10 years ago is we realised that so many of our people had addiction problems, that much though many of us enjoyed our whiskey club kind of scene, it was actually being harmful for others. So we now have a rule that on GalGael, at GalGael events and outings, we have no alcohol or drugs, and that way we're able to be much more inclusive. But the name GalGael is very interesting because we formed GalGael in 1997, building on the Pollock Free State motorway protest in Glasgow. So you remember those 1990s motorway protests? Our one was the Pollock Free State, partly inspired by what was happening with Newbury and places like that. There was a lot of sharing going on between us. And what was happening is that people were coming out of their high-rise flats, coming out of circumstances of poverty, because, you see, the motorway was not being put through the golf courses of the rich. The motorway was being put through a place where it went past 5 primary schools and cut poor people off from access to Pollock Park. And people were coming out, they were coming down to the protest camp, sitting around the campfire, telling stories, making music, always the sharing of food. And it was lovely. I mean, some of these Asian restaurants at the end of the night, they'd pull in and they'd drop us off the curry and whatever was left over, that kind of stuff. And we realised that community was happening because people were reconnecting with place. People were connecting with the nature of place. And so Colin and Johann MacLeod, who were the key founders of GalGael, I was one of the founding trustees, I am one of the founding trustees, but it was really them who led it. As Colin said, when the motorway started to be driven through relentlessly, Colin said, well, okay, folks, We've shown them what we're against. Now let's show them what we're for. We've shown them what we're against. Now let's show them what we're for. So they asked me if I would help write a constitution for an organisation. So I actually hijacked the Egg Trust Constitution, which we'd had a lawyer write, and I just put GalGael in and, with an awareness of charitable objectives, tweaked it. Okay? But then we had to question, what are we going to call it? And one day, Colin came to me with a book he had, and he said, "See this, Alastair, what do you make of it?" And he said, in the 9th century, in the Scottish Hebrides and the west and Ireland, west of Ireland, there were so many people of mixed blood because of the incursions of Norse coming down. So you had the admixture of the Scandinavian and the Celtic, that they became known as the GalGael. Now the word Gal means stranger, and the Gael are the heartland people, the indigenous. And Colin said, that's us. There's a bit of the stranger from wherever. His wife, Jahan, has that name because her maiden name is Ibrahim. Her father is an Egyptian Muslim. Her mother became the teacher on Egg eventually, after the buyout, an English woman. You see, very GalGael. And we said, you know, we were looking at what was happening with xenophobia in the world. And we were seeing the desperate hunger and the benefits of people connecting by making community, not just community of interests, not just a community of boat builders or whatever, but community of place, geographical community. But we also recognized how the far right was using that. And the far right was exploiting the hunger in England for connection with an English identity by trying to make out that the reason you can't have it is because of multiculturalism, which they turned into a toxic word and made politically correct. Their name for justice became political correctness. So we thought, you know, we've got something in our history here, GalGael. We can build on that. But more than that, in Scottish tradition, there are two sacred duties: hospitality for the short term and fostership, adoption for the long term. And this reflects in our proverbs. The bonds of milk, of nurture, are stronger than the bonds of blood. Blood counts for 30-fold. Fostership counts 100-fold. Because when you are fostered, when you are adopted into a community, you choose that community and you become chosen by that community. So we adopted the name GalGael. It's also in our poets. Robert Burns, if you excuse his gendering of his 18th century era, for our that and our that, it's coming yet for our that man to man, the world around, shall brothers be for our that, shall sisters be for our that. Okay? You see, we built on those and built a sense of what the Scottish executive, as it was then called, now Scottish Government, subsequently derived the caption from, of one Scotland, many cultures. So I think you can have indigeneity. Elizabeth, I remember the late Walt Brissett, a Chippewa, a Anishinaabe spiritual and activist leader, in a ceremony we did in the University of Wisconsin at a conference on nature and religion in 1996. And on the last day of the conference, I went over to him. He was sitting there with a number of young Native Americans, and I was noticing how the white academics were not mixing with them. So I went over and said, "Can I sit with you? Welcome." And I said, "So what do you think of the conference, Walt?" And he said, "Plenty about nature, not much about spirituality." And it was like that fire came into me. I felt that fire come into me. You see, when you're watching, when you're waiting, when you've got lamp in the oil of life, I felt that fire come in. And I said to him, "So what are we going to do about it?" He said, "You stay here. I'm going to go to my car and get my medicine bundle. You stay here." So we were gathering that night, all the big high Hegian figures Baird Collicott, all of the big names in eco-theology and what have you. And we're having a closing panel. And I went up to Bron Taylor, the professor of religion at Florida University, who had organised this, his book, Dark Green Religion, some of you might know. Dark Green Religion. And I said, Bron, see tonight when we're each going to have, 20 minutes or whatever it was, to give our closing statements on the panel. Could you transfer my time over to Walt and put the two of us last? And he said, well, I was going to have Baird Collicott last, but Bron sensed there was a reason for this. And then I said to Tara O'Leary, one of my former students, an Irish woman who had also been invited to the conference, I said to Tara, Tara, see all the young students here. Can you have a word with them and get them to go down to the refectory and bring up piles of those tin trays they've got? And Tara knew, sure, it didn't need words. So, the closing plenary starts. And we come finally to me, and then Bron says Alastair's asked for his time to be given over to Walt Grissett. And Walt gets up, and we're in this room, and there's 4 doors. And Walt gets up, and he says, shut the door! Shut the door! Shut the door! Shut the door! And he rolled out his medicine bundle. And he had his drum there. And Tara had distributed a tray each to the students. And we didn't have to tell anybody, it just started. And Walt says, we are all inside now. To heal the earth, we must all rise to the responsibility of becoming indigenous once again. And he lit his sage and went round with his feather, smudged every one of us, blessing us. And that was the blessing we brought back into GalGael. I hadn't thought, what I just said just now, I hadn't quite thought of it like that, but that was 1996. We set up GalGael in 1997.
Thank you. I have about 94 other questions, but I am going to exercise some restraint and to try and not be selfish and open this to the floor.
Hi, I'm Rina, and I love that you end with being indigenous. So I, for some reason, through the generations and lineage, I represent my great-grandmother, who's white Cherokee. So my question, to bounce off Liz's query about why the sense of place is a paradox, because this sense of rootedness and getting stuck with national identities. So my question is, how does one prune away from place, which according to Tyson Yunkaporta in his sand talk, place is not necessarily nation state. Right? And then so that the loss in translation of what place is in terms of immediate identification of what that is. So to repeat it, how does one prune away from place or placelessness? Prune away from the politics as passport.
The politics and...
Politics as passport.
Politics as passport.
Yeah.
Could you just say a little bit what you mean by that phrase?
Yeah. So prune away. So because when we say place, I'm often, and which is why I ended up in stand-up comedy sometimes, I get the frequent, where are you from? No, where are you from?
Yeah.
Right? So the sense that place where you're from has to be a passport, like a nationality, rather than the land or the incredible ecological diversity of my home or where the dandelions grow, etc. So so that's what I meant by politics as passport, because when we're talking about politics, it's not people of a place or of a land in terms of its diversity, but it's more people of a place as defined by nation state and passport. So how do we prune away that politics passport from place?
The way I see it, yesterday something went up on the web by a research program going on at York University, and it was uploaded yesterday. I put it on my website during the train. I was asked as part of a research thing to talk about civilization and civil society and what makes for it. And the way I presented it is that we're all born of parents, whether we knew them or not. We may have been born into families, depending on our circumstance. Families build up into communities where we live, whether well-rooted or highly transient. Communities of place build up into nations as community writ large. Nations that may or may not have the mechanisms of state, like Scotland has been described as a stateless nation. It doesn't have full sovereignty over itself as a nation. And then ultimately to a world of 8 billion people. And so I would say it is up to you how you define. Yes, look at her laughing. It's up to you how you define it. It's also up to you to discern how it has been given to you. Given your background, I would imagine that you will have had elders who would have passed on to you what I like to call, if I may, the touch of blessing. Yep, you will have had that. And what worries me, what I see as being, what in GalGael we see as being a very profound poverty, is people who've never had that. People who have been rootless as children. With the Queen doing Paddington Bear the other day, I wrote a piece on Bella Caledonia, unpacking the psychology of Paddington, because Mr. and Mrs. Brown were in the original 1958 book. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were at Paddington Station to pick up their daughter Judy from boarding school. What my friend Nick Duffel would call privileged abandonment in some cases. Oh, we have a few of you who know it. Okay. Not everybody experiences like that by any means, but enough for it to be a serious problem. And what we notice in Scotland is that so many people who've had that kind of background, they will have their marmalade sandwich in their tuck box. I'm keeping mine for later. You may not have seen the video I'm referring to as a Queen and Paddington Bear, but if you have, you know what I'm speaking to. That sense of insecurity that is built into it. And so many people, whether through privilege or through deprivation, and I live in a context where it's full of people's deprivation, have never had the touch of blessing into their place. So what we are doing, my friend, in GalGael is we're building boats. We're people building boats or doing other woodwork activities. It's only every so often. You can't be building a boat all the time. And then we get them out onto the River Clyde. What was a dirty river associated mainly with suicide or with murder victims with blocks of concrete round their feet. And suicide is such an issue. A month ago, with the money from the Quakers, my wife took the Rose Garden group in Govan, a group of volunteers, many of them in addiction recovery, to the Benmore Botanical Gardens. One of them wrote, I gave them out notebooks before they left, I wasn't able to go. One of them wrote in his book, "This day has been a gift of God." And then when she went to the garden last Sunday, one of them, Davy, was, instead of doing the weeding of the road garden, he was sitting on the bench, blind drunk. And she could hardly make out what he was saying. It was a combination of his Glasgow accent and severe drunkenness. In that week, he had just lost 2 of his friends. She didn't even ask how he lost them, because you know in that community to lose friends of your own age is nearly always either suicide, drugs, or your liver blowing up from alcohol abuse. So you see, what we're doing is that in that depth of poverty, things like the rose garden, weeding a rose garden, things like going out in a boat and rowing together, maybe down to the sea, maybe raising the sail, that brings you back into community of real people in real places. And the beauty is you can take that everywhere. You can take that everywhere. If I wasn't here just now, I would be up on the Isle of Egg, celebrating its 25th anniversary of the land reform buyout that we got going, we got going in 1991. It took us 6 years to bring it to community buyout. I would be up there celebrating communities in Scotland, bypassing landed power standing in the way of community, using landed power not to enable community, but to suck out of community, bypassing that and bringing the land back into community ownership. So these are the ways we are doing it in practice in Scotland. And notice the little ways. I said to Nick this morning, I said, thank you for what you are doing here because you're holding a place hospitable to the soul. Now, I am not qualified to comment on the wider aspect of the Shaftesbury estates. I can only say what I'm seeing here. Here is how you make community. With the staff working here, acknowledging them, and I'm not the only one who's been doing that, I've noticed, but I watch, I look out for these things. Acknowledging the making of community is how you do it. So I would suggest that what we can learn in our indigenous or semi-indigenous communities, including industrial wasteland communities, like I've just described, is actually a transportable skill. It's something, community is something we carry in our hearts, and that, Elizabeth, is because ultimately we're not just isolated individuals, egos competing, fighting with each other, knocking each other out until it's only this one that's left. Okay. But we are members one of another, as St. Paul put it on a good day. We are branches on that vine of life. Ultimately, ultimately, community is our grounding in the God space. And if I might just indulge one further moment, because I brought with me, because I was quoting it in this part of civilization. In 1977, and forgive me if I mispronounce it, the Haudenosaunee Six-Nation Iroquois Confederacy went to Geneva and spoke to the United Nations organizations. And the end of this book is fascinating in the message that they gave to the world, because they're talking about colonization. They're talking colonialism is at the heart of the impending world crisis. Now, by colonialism, think, where does our coffee come from? That kind of stuff, not just what happened in the past. And they say this, a strategy for survival must include a liberation theology. And they're talking about liberation theology in the full Christian 1970s sense. They're also drawing on Paulo Freire of Brazil, and they're also setting it in this indigenous context. Must include a liberation theology. Call it a philosophy or cosmology, if you will. But we believe it to be a theology. Or humankind will simply continue to view the earth as a commodity and will continue to seek more efficient ways to exploit that which they have not come to respect, to exploit that which they have not come to respect, to do something again, spect as in spectacles falling off me here, to take a deeper look. They have not come to respect. If these processes continue unabated and unchanged at the foundation of the colonizers' ideology, our species will never be liberated from the undeniable reality that we live on a planet of limited resources, and sooner or later we will exploit our environment beyond its ability to renew itself. Their call is a basic call to consciousness, a call to the sacred. And thank you to those Native American teachers. Thank you to those Native American teachers who have shared that with us, not giving us permission to appropriate their ways, but inviting us to explore our ways. And what do we find? But if we dig deep enough, we find that these are archetypal human principles by which we re-indigenize.
Thank you.
My name is Lauren, and thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I live in Paris, France, and I'm trying to create a space.
In where?
In Paris.
In Paris.
Paris, France. And I'm trying to create a space that is hospitable to the soul, bringing together communities that otherwise rarely speak to each other in any sort of real way. And I'm just curious, being in this space that is so, where laïcité is used as a way to sweep away difference. And universalism is also used as a way to silence voices. How do you have techniques, ways, strategies for how to get past, how to obviate those impasses, to create a space where people can come in, enjoy to speak with rigor and with receptivity?
The poet Adrienne Rich, in her collection Dream of a Common Language, she has the line that we've used a lot in the Scottish peace movement, and I will try and remember it accurately, but I may get it slightly wrong. My heart is moved by all I cannot change. So much has been destroyed. I have to call my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. With no extraordinary power, perversely. In practical terms, I would say organize the sharing of food. One of the things I sometimes do is GalGael. We have every Thursday night we have a community meal. Anybody is welcome, and then there'll be a sharing and the GalGael grace, because we realized we needed something that took us a bit deeper. And an English guy, Jethro, was visiting, and he wrote the GalGael grace that we use at our meals. But the sort of thing I will sometimes do is I'll make a huge big rice pudding. It's so cheap to make, All you need is 6 litres of milk. To feed 30, you need 6 litres of milk. You need only about 200 grams of pudding rice, short-grained rice, and some nutmeg and sugar. And I must confess, I pour in a pot of cream as well, and maybe some sultanas or something, and you shove it in the oven for 2 or 3 hours. And, it feeds the 5,000. And another thing, so your community meals are one thing, bring and share, potluck type of things. Another one is walks, proposing a walk. And proposing a walk, not just any old walk, oh, what a pretty flower, but a walk that can lead people into progressive layers of psychospiritual depth. A pilgrimage, that kind of stuff. Another thing is a reading thing. So you might say, any one of you here might say, to your friends, I've read an interesting book and I'd love to discuss it. We could do that on Zoom, or if you'd all like to come round to my place, I'll put on a simple meal, bread and soup. And you might want to bring your own booze. I usually find I profit on the whiskey at such events. Jonathan, where's Jonathan gone? Where's he gone? He's disappeared. I did a wonderful one. Walter Wink, the great late American theologian, a good friend of mine, who wrote the trilogy on the powers, naming the powers. We must name the powers that be, that oppress us. Unmasking the powers. We must unmask how they cause oppression. Engaging the powers. We must wrestle the powers non-violently, to call back power to its God-given higher vocation. Okay, so 3 or 4 years ago, I put on a Walter Wink reading book, and his widow, June, said to me that Walter always used to say, start with the last one in the trilogy. read Engaging the Powers. Don't read the short version. Read the full Engaging the Powers. It's such deep activism. Whoa! It took me several years to read it. It was so deep. It carried me through the Isle of Egg campaign and the Harris Super Quarry campaign. And what we did was I put out an invite on Twitter, and about 16 people came to our house. But you know what? I said to them, look, the entry, the secret pass for the entry is you either have to bring a copy of one of Walter Wink's books that is battered and with the pages falling out because it's not very well bound. And that's your entry ticket. Or you have to bring a bottle of whiskey. Friends, I'm still enjoying the success of that. Pat, hello. Okay, now, so Pat is probably the one guy here who can really call bullshit on me, because we're all friends from Scotland. Pat, how lovely to see you both here.
And hearing you reference Twitter, Zoom, and the World Wide Web in the last hour and a half or so, I want to do 1.5 cheers for mechanistic materialism. But I mean only 1.5 cheers, because obviously we're in a techno juggernaut, out of control. So given that that's there, it's built in, it's incumbent, and given that my cosmos is a material cosmos rather than a spiritual cosmos, we've had that discussion.
Yeah, we've had that discussion.
We don't need to have it again.
I hope it's going to continue.
I know, I do. Score draw. But just to kind of make it concrete, if Google asked you to be on their ethics board,
If who?
Google.
Doodle time.
No. if only Google time. Google, the internet company. One, would you say yes? And two, if you said yes, what would you recommend?
I mean, to the first part of your question, after we successfully kicked Lafarge, the super quarry company, Redland, the original English company, that was going to destroy the highest mountain in the South National Scenic Area of South Harris for Roadstone, after that battle that ran from 1991 to 2004, and during which Redland got taken over by Lafarge, the biggest cement company in the world, then operating in 82 countries of the world. After the way it worked out, because Pat of bringing the spirituality into it, and how that touched a French banker, Thierry Grussa, who'd read Soil and Soul, and who then connected me up with Lafarge, I got invited onto the sustainability stakeholder panel. And so I consulted with all my main activist contacts, including in the local community. And I said, should I do it or not? And they said, yes, but don't take their money. And I realized that in that instance, and it might be different in other contexts, but in that instance, I had to do this unpaid expenses only. So for 10 years, up until 2013, we would meet twice a year with the executive board of Lafarge, the CEO, chairing it, or go to their plant, addressing the question, we all use...
maybe not in this house.
Here we all use quarry products. I knew there'd be some marble somewhere in here. we all use quarry products, Alastair, said Lafarge to me. So how can we do it in a better way? So yes, I served on that board, and it was an immensely rich experience. And the second part of your question again was...
what would you recommend?
Sorry?
What would you recommend to Google?
What would I recommend to Google? Do no evil. You know what he's going to say? He's going to say, there he goes. It's exactly when you try to pin him down in spirituality. He finds a backdoor way out. But I mean, how you unpack that?
Yes.
How you unpack that? Our ground of being, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy community come, thine opening of the way, the Dharma, the Tao, be done on earth as is in heaven. Lead us not into temptation. Now, the Vatican recently tweaked that bit, because why would God lead you into temptation? A Jungian reading of that passage, which Jung picks up on in books like Answer to Job. And in a way, Elizabeth, this comes round full circle to the title of our talk today, which was not a title I chose, it was the title suggested, but it was something to do with, I forgot what it was exactly, something to do with nature and being.
Yeah.
And of course, my position would be that it is through being that we become conscious of nature and of our beingness in nature. Lead us not into temptation. Why? I mean, first of all, something exists. So you either believe in God or you believe in magic. Okay? It's up to you to choose whether you believe in magic, so something can come out of nothing, because there ought to be nothing on a principle of parsimony. Or you can sense that through consciousness, there are layers of depth that lead you through love, through the works of mercy, through building the beloved community, as Martin Luther King puts it. Works of mercy, Dorothy Day, Catholic worker. That there is a sense in which the divine had cause, found meaning in the creation of being, in the creation of human being and other life being, and in all probability other planetary being and all the rest of it. Okay? But how does God, in the fullness of all eternity, or perhaps does God, in the fullness of all eternity, in the time that comprises all eternity, is God perhaps also on a journey of creation and becoming? Is there a sense in which part of the human program is to say to God, lead us not into temptation, for which the biblical proof text, you see my Presbyterian background, my goodness, those Free Church people in the Isle of Lewis have served me well in this, and continue to serve me well. You know, when I go home to Lewis, I'll often go into the Free Church or the Free Church of Scotland. Thank you. Once you feel no longer controlled by something, you can move so lightly with it. Lead us not into temptation. And Jung kind of poses the question, is there a sense in which humanity calls God to account? And in the passage in Genesis, the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, which incidentally was not about gays, but was about people being violent and exploitative. You know, let us have fun in being fundamentalist about the matter. Let's properly read the text and see what's going on there. Just as Noah's flood was because of the violence upon the earth. And in that text, the usual translations are that Abraham stood before God in appealing for the city to be saved. And you then get the bit about, and I'm going to paraphrase, you know, if you can find just 100 good people, I'll save the city. Okay, if you can find just 10, I'll save the city. There's no good people, okay, zap! The city's nuked. But is it God that nukes the city? Or is it our own violence that nukes the city? But the interesting thing is, Pat, that in one of the key early Hebrew texts, and there will be people here who will, you know, I always have to research these things, I don't always remember them clearly. There'll be people here who will know better than I do, but in one of the key texts, it is actually God that stands before Abraham. It is not Abraham that stands before God. It is God who stands before Abraham as Abraham haggles for God to become more human, more humane, but deliver us from evil. Google, of course. That's the message to Google. The Lord's Prayer. We will, and Pat, just imagine the good karma. Well, they don't believe in karma, okay. They believe in justification by grace, not justification by work. But just imagine when I go back to the Hebrides and I say to them, I've been to Google and I had every meeting opening with the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, there's a definite sliding doors, your life as a Presbyterian preacher. One more question?
Thank you. Thank
Oh,
you.
wait a minute, sorry. Speak!
Thank you, Alastair. It's been an absolute joy to listen to you today. I live quite nearby to here in a small estate village, which is similar to this. It's smaller but similar in that it's in single ownership by someone that's inherited it through family generations. But in our community, we've been really inspired by your story of Egg. So much so that I'm going up there this summer. We're really, really inspired by that story. So my question to you is, in this county where there's still many estates that are in single ownership, should we be aspiring to community buyouts?
Well, one of the theologians, I'm just going to stand so I can see you. Is this the last question?
It's the last question.
It's the last one. Okay. So I can end with a wee story. In 1990, the Gifford Lectures on Natural Religion at Edinburgh University were being given by Raymond Panikkar on the theme The Rhythm of Being. Panikkarji, of an Indian father, Spanish mother, both Hindu and a Catholic priest, who says, I am not half Indian and half Spanish. I am not half Hindu and half Catholic. I am wholly Indian and wholly Spanish and wholly Christian, wholly Hindu. Note that in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of belongingness. Okay? And he gave this wonderful, we got him over to Govan, which is a hard-pressed area. He filled the MacLeod Hall in the Pearce Institute. And our conference theme was no life without roots. Note that expression, no life without roots. De racines pour vivre. It was bouncing off a book by the Belgian thinker Thierry Verhelst. And Panikkarji's lecture theme was agriculture, technoculture, or human culture. And at the end of it, in the question time, I put up my hand. I was on the organising committee, but I was in the audience. And I said, Panikkarji, you have given a wonderful exposition of what is wrong with the world. How do you put it right? And he said, it is not for me to tell you the how. You must work out the how for yourself. Now, I would say that in your English situation, it does feel different to the Scottish situation, but you must work out the how for yourself from groundedness in that community. However, there is a slight postscript to the story. Because at the end, Professor Frank Whaling, the interfaith professor at Edinburgh University, was going upstairs to interview Panikkar, and it fell on me to take them the tray of tea. So I took the tray of tea up with the milk and the sugar and laid it down on the little table between them, and I pour Panikkar's tea, and I, with milk or whatever, I can't remember now if he had milk, but basically I passed him the sugar. 1 spoonful of sugar. 2 spoonfuls of sugar. 3 spoonfuls of sugar. At which he looks at me and says, how many And I cut him off, panic-arching. It is not for me to tell you the how. You must work out the how for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Alastair.
much. Thank you for holding a space, because I was saying to Elizabeth, the quality of what can come out of an event like this depends upon the quality to which these spaces hospitable to the soul can make it possible. There's important learning in that. If you're chairing something, how you hold that space is as important as the speaker themselves.